Story 1. The Calm Before the Feast. How Polynesian Chiefs Planned Tranquility. The islands rose slowly from the sea, not with violence but with the slow certainty of erosion and time. Somewhere in the triangle formed by Hawaii, Rapa Nui, and Aotearoa, there was a hush that wrapped itself around the days. Here, on the quieter outer islands of what is now called Polynesia, life did not rush. It paddled, it waited, it listened. The great Polynesian feasts, so often mythologized in colorful terms by later visitors, were, in truth, measured affairs. Not in emotion, perhaps, but in pace, in process, in patience, and most importantly, in planning. For a Polynesian chief, an alley hosting a feast was less about spectacle and more about serenity. It was about ensuring that food, people, and the invisible threads of mana, spiritual power, all arrived at precisely the right time. This required no small amount of logistics. But unlike in other parts of the world, logistics in Polynesia did not shout. It waited for the tides. Sailboat the ocean as a clock. Time in Polynesia was not kept by bells or sand. It was held by the ocean. Chiefs planned their gatherings by the rising and falling of the moon and the behavior of the waves. Waves were not just water. They were a form of information. You, the listener, might imagine staring out at the sea and seeing sameness. But for the Polynesian navigator and the feast planner alike, the sea was a moving scroll, each ripple a syllable, each swell a sentence. If the swells arrived from the north, it might mean that the breadfruit would ripen later. If the clouds over the western reef moved low and long, it might mean rain in 4 days. If a certain seabird was seen flying inland at dusk, then the schools of fish were changing their patterns. These quiet observations were as central to preparing for a feast as the cooking of taro or the building of the umu, the underground oven. A feast was never simply a date. It was a harmony of when the canoes returned, when the pigs were properly fattened, when the gods were calm, and when the winds grew still enough for messages to be spoken, not shouted. Herb food not fast, but intentional. You might be tempted to imagine roasted pigs turned on spits, dancers in garlands of flowers, and laughter beneath coconut trees. But first, before the feast, before the color, there was the gathering. And the gathering was slow. Taro, the starchy root that formed the base of most Polynesian diets, had to be grown in terraces carved patiently over generations. A good lai, or taro patch, was a living document, built by ancestors and read by descendants. Its stones, perfectly fitted without mortar, shaped the flow of water with deliberate calm. To plant taro, you waited for the rains. You pressed the cut stalk gently into the soft mud. You watched. You did not rush. If the water flowed too quickly, the young plants would rot. If too slowly, they would parch. Yams were planted with a similar patience. Bananas, breadfruit, and pandanus were watched seasonally, spoken to even in some traditions. Food in Polynesia was not produced. It was raised like a child in dialogue with nature. And then there were the pigs. They were not eaten often. A pig was wealth, raised over many months, fed taro leaves and scraps, and sometimes sung to, particularly if it was being fattened for a special guest. A single pig might represent weeks of effort, and to kill it was not a decision made lightly, nor was it done in haste. The process had a rhythm, a story. Fire the umu, a hearth beneath the earth. Polynesians did not build fires in open pits. They built umu. You can imagine them stone-lined holes dug into the ground, filled with heated river rocks. Food wrapped in banana or tea leaves would be lowered in, covered in more leaves and then earth, and then left to steam, to tender, to transform. And during that waiting, the island would grow quiet. The umu was central not just to cooking but to the notion of patience itself. It was where flavor was shaped slowly, not seared into being. You didn't check the umu every hour. You trusted it. You let time do its work. Some say you could smell when the food was done, even before opening it. Others say you could feel the heat of the rock's underfoot changing texture, but in all cases there was no timer, no ticking, only knowing. Footprints, a feast of movement, not noise. Perhaps what's most misunderstood about Polynesian feasts is that they were not just for the belly, they were for the body. But not in terms of indulgence, in terms of preparation. When a feast was to be held, the alley's messengers would walk, or paddle, often for days. One canoe might carry only an announcement. Another might deliver a ceremonial mat woven over 3 weeks. People came not in crowds but in lines, in single canoes, not barging in but arriving with the tide. Every guest was expected to bring something, a food item, a gift, a chant, even a silence. To the modern ear it might sound excessive. Why not just call everyone on the same day and say, "Come now"? But that was not the way of the islands. Time was slower and, more importantly, shared. The role of silence and chant. Many Polynesian societies prized silence during certain parts of the feast, not out of shyness or discomfort, but as a way to make room for the presence of ancestors. Chants were performed not to entertain but to invite. These chants, called oli in Hawaiian tradition, might describe a genealogy, a recent storm, or a crop's unusual flavor. They were not dramatic. They were recitations, rhythmical and steady, often monotone. Listeners did not cheer. They nodded. They waited for the chant to end before responding. Imagine this: a clearing near the sea, the wind gentle but not absent, people sitting cross-legged on woven mats, smoke still rising from the covered umu, a chanter standing alone, repeating a name, a place, a year again and again, like a heartbeat. It was not spectacle, it was attention. Balance the alley as the steward of calm. To be a chief in Polynesian society was not to be loud. It was to be responsible, not just for wealth but for rhythm. An alley could be removed if he disrupted the island's balance, what some islands called pono, meaning righteousness, balance, or right order. A feast, then, was a way for the chief to demonstrate his ability to maintain harmony. There were rules. Certain foods were forbidden to certain people. Certain seats were reserved. To eat outside your rank was not scandalous, it was dangerous. It was thought to anger the gods. Thus calm was maintained not just through custom but belief. A wrong movement, a misplaced word, could undo the peace of the village. And so everyone learned to wait, to follow, to trust the pace of tradition. Dava stillness in the middle of the ocean. The thing to remember is that Polynesia is vast. Thousands of miles of ocean, tiny islands like freckles on the water. And yet, despite this vastness, these societies found a way to gather, to cook, to share. Without megaphones, without armies, without cities. They used the ocean, the stars, the memory of stone paths and family trees. And when they finally gathered, when the food was pulled from the umu, and the mats were rolled out, and the first chant began, what mattered most was not the flavor of the pig or the sweetness of the yam. What mattered most was that everything had arrived on time, quietly, just as it always had. And so we end this first chapter of the feast before the feast, where nothing happened quickly but everything, somehow, happened exactly when it needed to. But as the guests begin to arrive, and the gifts are laid out one by one, a deeper question begins to rise with the tide. What happens when something disrupts this calm? When a feast begins not with rhythm, but with hesitation? The feast had been planned for months, maybe longer. On a small, reef-fringed island nestled in the Tuamatu archipelago, a chief named Tava had chosen a date, not a calendar date, but a moment. A window between the breadfruit harvest and the next moon, when the seas would rest just long enough for distant canoes to arrive. Chief Tava was not a loud man. He was, by all accounts, a quiet one who listened more than he spoke. His authority was tied not to charisma, but to the calm he radiated. His mana, that spiritual presence inherited and earned, flowed not from war or conquest, but from stillness. He was known for preparing the island's largest feast of patience, as it came to be called. But something was different this time. A canoe had arrived early. Canoe the arrival that was too soon. The canoe came at dawn, its outrigger creaking slightly as it cut across the lagoon. It was smaller than most ceremonial vessels, and the paddlers wore no flowers, no woven mats, no offerings on display. Just a folded cloth bundle near the bow. They came from the island of Rangiroa, a neighboring atoll. Not far by modern maps, but in a world ruled by wind and tide, it was considered a distant cousin in the archipelago's family. Their arrival broke the rhythm. Normally, guests would time their journeys to arrive with the others, like fish converging on a reef. Early arrival was, in a sense, disruptive. It created imbalance. It set the wrong tone. And more importantly, it forced the host to react before the umu had even been dug. Chief Tava walked slowly down the beach to greet them. He did not speak right away. He let the wind pass first. The leader of the visiting canoe stepped forward and bowed not deeply but respectfully. His name was Panoa. He was not a chief but an emissary. His eyes were tired, his voice low. "We come early," Panoa said, "because there is unrest." When feasts turned into councils. In Polynesian tradition, a feast could serve multiple purposes. It was not just about celebration. It could be a meeting of chiefs, a reaffirmation of alliances, or more rarely a moment to resolve quiet tensions. Tensions that, like volcanic islands, rose silently until they could not be ignored. Panoa's island had suffered an unusually dry season. The taro yields had dropped, pigs had grown thin, breadfruit trees, usually so generous, had given half their fruit to the wind. And now, some said, other islands were sending less food in tribute than before. Whispers had begun. Was Rangiroa losing its mana? Had they displeased the gods? Or worse, had Chief Tava grown distant? The feast, once expected to confirm the peace of the region, was now a test of it. Chief Tava listened. He nodded slowly. He asked no questions. Instead, he said, "We will prepare." And with that, he ordered the messengers to be sent. Whirled the canoes and the code. Each island in the chain had its own canoe design, its own chant style, its own variations on the same staple crops. But they shared something else, a network of couriers, waterborne ambassadors who carried messages across the waves. These messengers did not speak for themselves. They spoke for tides and ancestors. Each one carried memorized lines of poetry, genealogies, and messages wrapped in metaphor. To forget a line was to dishonor your island. A message from Tava to another chief might read, "The stone garden waits for a fourth son," meaning the feast would take place in 4 days. Another line, "The pigs turn on their own side now," might mean that each island should bring meat rather than expect it. But now the messengers carried more than instructions. They carried anxiety. The early arrival of Panoa would have been noted. His canoe's shape, its arrival time, the color of its paddles, all of these would become part of the island gossip. What did it mean, they would ask, that Rangiroa came without chant, without offering? And just like that, the feast was no longer only about serenity. It was also about balance and saving it. Straight ruler, the protocols of seating. You might imagine the feast as a large communal table, food passed around in friendship. But that would be wrong. Polynesian feasts were exercises in spatial diplomacy. Who sat where mattered. A chief sat closer to the food not because he was hungry, but because he represented order. The higher the rank, the closer to the umu. The farther down the line, the more humble the role. And each mat was placed with deliberate care. Woven pandanus mats, sometimes dyed with natural pigments, were unrolled with quiet ceremony. No one sat until the host invited them to. No one moved their mat. But now, because of Panoa's early arrival, an unplanned mat would have to be added. Where would he sit? Not at the edge, for that would be an insult. not at the center, for that would be presumptuous. Chief Tava sat with his advisors that evening and discussed this for hours. No voices were raised. No arguments were made. They spoke in proverbs and parables. One elder finally said, "The wind does not ask where to sit. It moves around everyone." And so it was decided. Panoa would serve, not sit. He would join the feast as a helper, not a guest, a position of humility that still allowed dignity. Fire the double umu. The next day, preparations for the umu began, but something unusual happened. Chief Tava ordered two to be built. One was large and central, the way it had always been, but the second, smaller one was built near the northern edge of the village, closer to where Panoa's canoe had landed. This was not a sign of favoritism. It was a gesture of inclusion. By offering Panoa the responsibility of tending his own umu, the chief acknowledged both his presence and his concern without elevating or diminishing him. Two ovens, two centers of heat, 2 points of patience. To an outsider, it may have seemed like redundancy. To the Polynesians present, it was symbolism layered in practical action. Tava had created room for anxiety but had contained it. That night the wind calmed slightly. Thread-woven reassurance. On the morning before the feast, Tava's daughters, each trained in the delicate art of lalaga, weaving, laid out their work. They had been weaving for weeks, mats, baskets, sashes. But the chief made a quiet request: an extra sash. It was nothing grand, just a simple braid of coconut fiber and pandanus, dyed a faded red with crushed noni fruit. It would be offered to Panoa before the first chant, not as an apology but as a reminder. You are seen, even in your early arrival. The giving of this sash would speak more than any chant could. It was Tava's way of rebalancing the feast before it even began. And in this action he preserved the silence, the calm, the sacred rhythm of the event. But there was still something left unresolved. A sign in the sky. That night, as the final mats were laid and the pigs were readied for the umu, the moon emerged with a soft crescent missing. To most, this meant little, but to the older navigators it was a symbol. The missing part of the moon was facing east, a sign, they said, that change was coming from beyond the known islands. Not tomorrow, not next week, but soon. And with that, the elders sat a little longer before going to sleep, their thoughts quiet but stirred. The feast had not yet begun, and already the balance had been tested. Tava had responded with grace. The people had followed the rhythm, and yet one could not help but wonder. If one canoe can arrive too early, what happens when another arrives too late? Morning broke with the same hush it always had. The lagoon, rimmed with sleepy palms, shimmered with a layer of mist too light to name. From the shoreline, mats had been unrolled, food laid out in soft, steaming mounds, and chants were already being softly rehearsed in shaded corners of the village. The umu stones had cooled just enough to reveal their work. Pork, taro, yams, fish, and wild banana, all wrapped in banana and tea leaves, sat warming in carefully carved wooden bowls. Not a shout had been heard all morning, not even from the children. The feast had been set, and yet Chief Tava did not sit. Water waved the canoe that didn't arrive. A single guest had not yet come. From the island of Anna, far across the reef line of the eastern sea, Chief Maelo was expected. He was not the most powerful chief, not the most revered, but his presence had always signaled completion. He was the one who remembered the names of every guest's grandmother, the one who closed the final chant with a story no one else could tell. He was also the oldest. His canoe had not been seen on the horizon. No birds flew overhead with the swirling flight patterns that marked a nearing vessel. No paddles flashed against the light of the mid-morning sun. And so Tava waited. It is not that he was worried, not outwardly, but he stood at the edge of the feast, his hands behind his back, as the breeze pulled gently at the edge of his woven sash. The gathered guests murmured softly, They did not eat, they did not sing. They simply waited. Hourglass done the art of waiting. In most societies, delay causes discomfort. In Western gatherings, the late arrival of a guest is often met with impatience or concern. In modern cultures, silence becomes awkward in minutes. But here, in this gathering of Outer Reef Polynesia, waiting was its own ritual. The food would keep, the stories could be postponed, the taro would not spoil in a single hour. The people, schooled from childhood in the rhythm of tides, knew that things arrived when they were meant to. Time was not something to be filled, it was something to be respected. And so, the entire feast sat in a kind of suspended harmony. Panoa, the early guest, sat near the smaller Umu, his hands folded. He had found peace in his temporary role as server. The sash given to him the day before still hung across his shoulder, quiet and symbolic. Even the children waited. And then a cry. Canoe the arrival without ceremony. The canoe was not large. It cut the water low, barely above the surface, and only one person sat at the stern, Chief Mahilo. He paddled alone. This was unusual. A chief never traveled without at least one paddler, one singer, one witness. But Melo's canoe came empty of ceremony. It reached the shallows slowly. No one rushed forward. That was not the way. Tava stepped to the edge of the water, and when Mailo's feet touched land, the two men bowed not deeply, but long enough to let the silence settle. "I am late," Mailo said. "You are right on time," Tava replied. No more words were needed. The story that could not be missed. Mailo was helped to a mat, his usual one, the same that had been reserved for him every feast for decades. His knees bent slowly, creaking like old canoe wood. He took no food at first. He simply sat, breathing with the wind. Then, in a voice like woven rope, he began. "When I was a boy," he said, "I missed a feast. The tide came too soon. I was punished for it not with words but with a silence. For a year, no one told me the story that had been told that day." He paused. "I have remembered that silence all my life, so I come today not for the food but for the story." The guests leaned closer, not physically but inwardly. They listened with their breath. "I have one more to give." Speaking the final chant. Mailo did not chant with flourish. His oli was slow even by Polynesian standards. There was no melody, no tempo. It was a plain chant, a roll call of names. Not the names of chiefs, not of ancestors, but the names of the canoe builders, the fishermen, the taro tenders, and the women who had woven the feast mats. Each name was given space, a breath, a memory. He paused after every name. Some of the guests wept not loudly, but in the quiet way that Polynesians cry, eyes glistening, hands unmoved. It took nearly an hour. And then, finally, he ended with a line no one had heard before. "The sea does not remember who arrived first or last, only who left something behind. Fork and knife, the meal begins." With that, Chief Tava raised his hand not high, not sharply, but slowly, like the rising tide. The signal was clear. The feast began. But no one rushed. The first bite was taken by a child, encouraged gently by her grandmother. Others followed. The air filled with the subtle sounds of chewing, hushed laughter, the soft clatter of coconut bowls. No one raised their voice. There were no speeches, only eating, sharing, and the occasional line of chant murmured in gratitude. The double umu had fed everyone. And despite the delays, the early arrival, the silence, it was perfect. Counterclockwise arrows button, what the feast left behind. That evening, after the food was gone and the mats were rolled up, Tava stood at the edge of the lagoon again. The sea was flat, still, the kind of stillness that made you believe it had always been that way. The feast had succeeded not because it dazzled, but because it absorbed the unexpected. It made room for the early guest, the late arrival, and the shifting moon. It proved what the old ones had always said. Calm is not the absence of disruption. It is the ability to remain undisturbed by it. In the days that followed, Tava's island returned to its rhythm. Canoes left in singles and pairs. Mats were rewoven. The umu pits were filled and cooled. But the memory of that feast lived quietly in stories. Not loud ones, not dramatic ones. Just the kind told under a thatched roof, late at night, when the wind is soft and the stars have nothing left to say. And so ends the first story in our quiet journey through the past, where nothing much happened, except everything that mattered. Story 2, the rice counters of ancient Japan, the monks who measured serenity. The sun rose slowly over the Nara plain, catching the glint of wet rice paddies and tiled temple roofs in equal measure. It did not burst into the morning, it crept, like steam from a tea kettle. The year was 774 CE, though the monks did not think in numbers like that. They thought in seasons, in harvests, and in how many bags of rice had passed through the temple gates since the last frost. At the Tadaijai temple, nestled among the still forests of what is now Nara Prefecture, silence reigned not as a requirement but as a method. Monks walked without shoes, spoke only in designated hours, and when they worked, it was not for glory or spectacle. It was to count. Rice primarily. Not just grains, not just bowls, but the very rhythm of the nation. Japanese castle temples as storehouses. In 8th century Japan, the Buddhist temples served as more than places of worship. They were also the pulse points of the nation's economy. The Emperor Shamu, ruling in an era of centralized reform, had ordered the construction of provincial temples kokubunji across every province of the young Japanese state. Each was to be both spiritual and administrative, a place of prayer, yes, but also of measurement, storage, and stability. At Tadaijai, the largest and most important of these temples, this dual role was clearest. Rice flowed in as tax. The farmers brought it not to government offices but to the temple gates. The monks received it, not with ceremony but with ledgers and scales. Each delivery was recorded quietly, precisely. You might imagine monks deep in meditation, but many of them, for much of the day, were bent over low wooden tables, tallying bags of unhusked rice with dull charcoal sticks. A feast, no, but a feast for the records. Counting with calm. The rice counters lay monks known as shamuso wore simple robes. They did not preach. They did not copy scriptures. Their daily meditation was mathematical. How many koku, a unit equal to the amount of rice one person ate in a year, had been stored this month? How much of it had come spoiled? How many handfuls of millet had been mixed in, diluting its value? Each answer was written slowly with a brush, the ink drying in silence. A misstroke required starting over, not because of harshness but because precision was peace. The monks did not gossip. They did not hurry. They counted as they breathed. They recorded each bag's origin, village, family, and season. Some entries included notes: wet from river crossing, from old farmer with bad leg, late but acceptable. Even human error was documented with humility. And because of this, the temple's records were the most reliable in Japan. Teacup without handle, the monastic schedule. Each day followed a strict rhythm. Dawn, wake with the bell, silent meditation, one bowl of rice. Mid-morning, receive deliveries, measure and record, bow to each farmer. Noon, light meal, usually rice gruel, no salt. Afternoon, clean storehouses, check moisture levels, recount. Evening, chanting in the main hall, one final bowl, lights out before full dark. The rice was not guarded by soldiers but by repetition, by discipline, by knowing exactly what should be where and when. Theft was rare not because of fear but because it would disturb the records. Even small losses were noticed. One mouse found, an entry might read, one grain lost. They recorded that grain, not because it mattered in quantity, but because it mattered in peace of mind. Package the storehouses that breath. The rice granaries were constructed not just for volume, but for breath. Raised off the ground with wooden stilts, with slatted walls and carefully thatched roofs, the structures allowed air to circulate. Moisture was the enemy of preservation, and so the monks tracked humidity like priests tracked sins. Slips of mulberry paper with charcoal marks, primitive hygrometers, were hung inside the stores. If the paper curled too much, the monks adjusted the thatching. They opened the slats slightly wider. They recited small prayers not for abundance, but for balance. Insects were removed gently, swept away with soft brushes made from horsehair. No one swatted, no one cursed. There was no place for violence in a room meant to feed the future. Yen banknote, rice as currency, not commodity. In this era, coins were scarce and their value mistrusted, but rice was truth. 1 koku was enough to feed a person for a year. So, when a farmer delivered 10 koku, he was offering 10 lives' worth of sustenance. In return, he received protection, spiritual and occasionally political. Temples would store rice not only for themselves but for future famine. In hard years, the monks opened the granaries and distributed food. They kept exact records of what was taken out, by whom, and when. And in the margins of those records, one sometimes finds simple notes. Gave to widow, her children cried. Old man bowed 10 times, did not take more than he needed. Returned 3 scoops in spring. Rice was the economy, but it was also a mirror. It showed who people were when they were hungry. Person in lotus position, why counting was sacred. To modern ears, this work may sound dull, repetitive, boring, but to the monks it was closer to prayer. In the Buddhist tradition, attention to the present moment, mindfulness, was the path to enlightenment. And what better way to practice this than by counting each bag, each scoop, each grain with full awareness? Each delivery was a meditation. Each number a mantra. By writing it down, the monks believed they were balancing more than the books. They were balancing the spirit of the land. The sound of the tally. The only sound in the rice hall was the rustle of straw sacks, the light brush of feet on wooden floors, and the scratching of ink on paper. You might think such silence would be oppressive. But it was sheltering. A kind of silence that held you like a grain husk holds the kernel. A silence that said, everything is in its place. Until one day it was. Because one spring, the rice deliveries were late. And when they did come, the numbers didn't add up. One village previously punctual had sent only half its usual offering. And worse, the sacks were moist, mildewed, the grain had spoiled. The monks did not panic. They simply lit a lamp, opened the ledger, counted again. But in the margin, one monk wrote, "This is not a mistake, it is a message." The spoiled rice sat in a pile at the far end of the storehouse, not rotting, not yet, but with a moisture that whispered of ruin. A dozen sacks, all from one village, Katsuragi, a name well known to the monks of Tadaijai. For generations, Katsuraga's offerings had been exact, not generous, not late, not excessive, just precise. And now this. In silence, the monks examined the sacks. They did not accuse, they did not speculate, they noted. The records were updated to reflect the state of the grain. Unfit for storage. Humidity observed in interior layers. Odor faint but present. No one made a scene. That was not the way of the temple. But something had shifted. Candle the ledger monk's discovery. Among the monks tasked with daily records was an older man known as Son. He had once copied sutras by moonlight, and his handwriting was revered, small, balanced, exact. Son did not speak unless spoken to, and even then preferred to nod. He was the one who found the anomaly. Katsuragi had sent 42 sacks the year before, now only 21. At first, the assumption was poor harvest, But the other villages nearby had reported no such losses. The rains had been sufficient. The river had not flooded. Sohn found an older entry, a record from 18 years prior, noting a delivery of 22 sacks from Katsuragi during a similar harvest. Then, oddly, the amount had increased in the decades since. Why had it grown steadily for so long only to suddenly reverse? The other monks gathered around the scroll. They studied the ink, the brush marks, the spacing of the kanji. One monk said quietly, "This is not error, this is choice." House the silence of the village. A small delegation was dispatched not to punish, not to confront, but to understand. Monks did not carry swords, only ledgers, water flasks, and sandals tied with cloth. Katsuragi was not far, a 2-day walk. They followed the paths along the rice terraces, stopping only to bow to travelers. They slept in shrines, ate salted millet, and reached the village at dusk. What they found was strange. The people were home, the fields were tended, the roofs thatched, but the mood was muted, not fearful, not hostile, just inward. When the monks explained their visit, the headman offered water and space to sit, but he did not apologize. Instead, he said, "We sent what we could." Sohn, careful with words, replied, "What you could or what you would?" There was no answer, just a quiet nod. The temple's role as authority. This moment spoke to something deeper in Japanese history, a tension between the village and the temple. The temples were not governments, but they wielded power. They received tax and rice. They stored it. They redistributed it. They blessed it. To the farmers, temples were part sacred trust, part bureaucratic overseer. In peaceful times, this balance held. But when the burdens of taxation rose, or when a village's rice was diverted toward imperial projects like new roads, fortresses, or larger temple halls, resentment grew. Slowly, quietly, like mold in damp grain. The people of Katsuragi had not rebelled. They had not refused. They had sent just enough. And just enough to send a message. Cloud rice as resistance. In a world without letters, without pamphlets, without protest signs, rice became language. Sending half the usual amount signaled displeasure. Sending slightly spoiled sacks said, "We know how this will be received, and we're willing to let it rot." The monks, for their part, did not threaten. That would have been out of harmony. Instead, they asked, "What has changed?" The headman of Katsuragi answered slowly, "There is more to plant, but fewer hands. The young go to the capital, the old stay. The temple asks as it always has, but the river gives less." These were not lies, but neither were they full truths. The real answer was simpler. The village was tired. Tired of precision, tired of being measured, tired of giving away their best rice while their own meals grew thin. Balance the monks' dilemma. Back at Tadaijai, the delegation returned with their findings. Sohn presented his report not in anger, but with deliberate neutrality. No disease observed. No flood damage reported. Villagers cooperative but reserved. Rice received as offered. No further investigation advised. This last line caused a stir. The temple's abbot, a man known for his stern balance, questioned it. "If we accept spoiled grain, do we teach the next village to do the same?" Sohn bowed. "If we reject it, do we teach the people to fear us?" There was no clear answer. So the monks did what they always did in moments of uncertainty. They meditated. They recited sutras. They counted not rice this time, but breaths. And then they made a quiet decision. They would accept Katsuraga's offering. They would mark it as partial, not deficient. And they would not increase their expectation the following year. Chart decreasing a new line in the ledger. From that year onward, a new symbol appeared in the temple, records a small mark beside villages whose deliveries had changed without natural cause. It looked like a dot, but it meant observed shift. It was not punishment, it was memory. The monks had begun to track not just rice, but intent. They weren't just counters anymore. They were readers of mood, guardians of a fragile trust between temple and soil. And while the feasts remained small, the records told larger stories. Scroll the quiet ripple. Other villages saw the symbol. Some copied Katsaraga's strategy. Some increased their offering out of pride. Others grew more precise than ever, fearing they might be misunderstood. The records became a living history not of weather, not of yields, but of relationship. Each bag of rice, each number written, reflected a broader truth. That even in silence people speak. Even in boring, routine counting there is resistance, adaptation, communication. But still, one monk had a question. He returned to the spoiled grain, still lying apart, drying slowly in the corner of the storehouse. He looked at it and wondered. If rice can speak, can it lie? The pile of spoiled rice was not discarded. To throw it away would have been wasteful. To burn it, disrespectful. So the monks did what monks often did with things that did not fit neatly into ritual or reason. They waited. The grain lay under the eaves of the storehouse, drying slowly, the mold fatting as the spring rains gave way to the warmth of early summer. Each day, Sohn passed it on his way to the ledgers. Each day, he bowed ever so slightly not to the rice, but to the question it carried. If rice could carry truth, could it also deceive? The problem with perfection. At Tadaijai, record-keeping had always assumed honesty. The monks assumed the numbers they recorded bags, scoops, sacks reflected reality, that a village's rice harvest was reported faithfully, that what was given represented what could be given. But now Sohn saw the flaw in that logic. For decades, the rice flows had been increasing, slowly but steadily. Had harvests really grown that much? Or had the villages simply feared underreporting more than they feared scarcity? And then Katsuragi, a disruption not only in numbers but in narrative. What if the monks had mistaken compliance for agreement? What if precision had not been harmony, but tension under pressure? These thoughts, though unspoken, began to appear in the margins of the records. Sohn's notations grew slightly longer, not dramatic, just more descriptive. Delivered early, despite swollen river. Fewer carriers than usual. Sacks tied loosely intentional. Rice warm to the touch, dried in haste. The monks were still counting, but now they were also listening. Receipt a quiet audit. Sohn proposed an unusual idea to the abbot. Not a punishment, not a correction, but an audit. Not in numbers, in practice. He asked to visit 3 nearby villages, not to receive rice, but to observe, to sit with the farmers during harvest, to see how the rice was grown, stored, transported. It was not standard, but the abbot agreed. And so the monks began a journey not of miles, but of methods. National what they saw. In the first village, the rice was harvested early. A priest had advised it, fearing late rains. The result, underdeveloped grain, smaller yields, and a lighter tax burden. But the villagers still delivered the expected amount by mixing in millet and puffed husks. In the second, the granaries had been rebuilt with bamboo, too airy for the current weather. More rice spoiled in storage than was reported. In the third, they found a revelation. The fields were full, the harvest had been abundant. But when asked why their offering was smaller than last year, the village headman smiled and said, "We gave less because we knew you would not ask why." Books the rewriting of the records. Sohn returned with nothing in his hands, but much in his mind. He did not ask the temple to change the tax expectations. He asked for a new column in the ledgers. Next to each delivery line there would now be space for context, a brief note, a single phrase perhaps, but a space to account for the unspoken. Examples began to appear. Early frost reported. Storage roof collapsed. Sent rice late cattle sick. Less than expected, but children healthy. In time, these annotations became more valuable than the numbers themselves. They told the real story. Not of yields, but of life. Fallen leaf when the grain spoiled again. 3 years later, a small portion of rice from Katsuragi again arrived damp. But this time, it was not hidden. The villagers sent a message ahead. Rain came too soon, we send what we could save, the rest we eat. The monks wrote it down exactly. And when the rice arrived, they dried it, aired it, salvaged what they could. No judgment was passed, no warning given. Instead, the ledger entry read, Katsuragi, 19 sacks, 3 wet, received in trust. Person in lotus position precision, without punishment. The monks did not abandon counting. They did not loosen their records. In fact, their logs became even more detailed. But now they understood counting not as measurement, but as relationship. Numbers were still sacred, but only when wrapped in understanding. The monks began to teach this idea to novice record keepers. Count the grain, but also the hands that bring it. Record the number, but remember the hunger. A perfect ledger that does not reflect life is only ink. Leaf fluttering in wind, the end of the pile. As for the spoiled rice that had sat for all those seasons, it was finally fed to the temple animals. A small gesture, a symbolic one. But before they gave it away, Son took one last handful and poured it into a shallow bowl. He placed it beside a scroll. The scroll was blank. It was not meant to be written on. It was meant to remind the next scribe. Sometimes, even spoiled grain has a story to tell. And so ends the second story in our slow unraveling of forgotten histories. A tale not of kings or battles, but of ledgers, of damp grain, and of a silence that once heard could never be unheard. Story 3, The Bureau of Weights and Measures, France's Most Peaceful Revolution. Paris, 1790. The air was thick with speeches and ash. Outside the Palais Bourbon, pamphlets flew like leaves. Inside, the National Assembly debated liberty, equality, fraternity, and how many ounces were in a pound. It may seem strange to you, listening in the quiet dark, that amid the chaos of revolution, with heads soon to fall and thrones soon to collapse, the French chose to argue about measurement. But they did. Because bread was being sold by loaves, fabric by ells, and wine by pitchets, all of which changed meaning from one village to the next. And in a country with over 700 different units of measurement, sometimes varying by region, profession, or tradition, chaos wasn't just in the streets. It was in the scales. Salt a country of scales and shadows. Before the metric system, France was a mosaic of local systems. One town's liver pound was not the same as the next. A foot in Marseille was longer than one in Dijon. Even time could stretch or shrink depending on the church bell that marked it. This wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Peasants were charged unfairly by landlords using obscure units. Artisans couldn't compete with merchants from towns using more generous measures. Soldiers found their supplies shorted, bakers were accused of fraud, and farmers selling grain by inconsistent bushels were left confused and cheated. Even the guillotine, precise in its blade, couldn't cut through the mess of uneven measures. And so, in the early days of the French Revolution, while crowds tore down the Bastille, a smaller, quieter revolution began. It started with a question. What if the entire world measured things the same way? Magnifying glass tilted left the commission that counted quietly. The National Assembly formed a commission. No banners, no slogans, just a room full of scientists, philosophers, and mathematicians. Jean-Charles de Borda, Joseph Louis Lagrange, Pierre-Simon Laplace, names now known to few beyond mathematicians. Then they were the quiet minds of change. Their task was to design a new system of measurement that would be universal, the same across all people and professions. Natural, based not on the king's body but the earth itself. Decimal, divisible by 10, easily scalable. In short, boring, logical, and revolutionary. Globe showing Europe, Africa, a meter born from the earth. Rather than invent a unit out of nothing, the scientists decided to define the meter as 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the equator to the North Pole, measured along the meridian that passed through Paris. It was elegant, rational, unquestionable. But there was a problem. They had to measure that distance by hand. Hiking boot, the meridional mission. In 1792, two surveyors, Jean-Baptiste de Lambert and Pierre Machin, set out to measure the Paris meridian. One walked north from Paris to Dunkirk, the other south to Barcelona. They used a series of triangles called triangulation to estimate the curvature of the earth, one hill, one church steeple at a time. It was the most precise geographical survey ever attempted. It was also agonizingly slow. De Lambert hauled measuring rods across damp fields. Machin struggled to get clear lines of sight in mountain passes. Each angle had to be measured multiple times, using brass instruments that had to be perfectly level. Worse, the country was at war with itself. Towns suspected them of being spies. Soldiers confiscated their equipment. Once, Machin was jailed. Another time, he hid astronomical instruments in a hay cart. They persevered. And after 7 years, they returned with numbers. Abacus, a meter, a kilogram, and a dream. From their measurements, a platinum bar was cast, exactly 1 meter in length. Soon after, a kilogram was defined as the mass of 1 liter of water at the melting point of ice. No kings, no gods, no traditions. Just nature. The metric system was born. It included the meter length, the liter volume, the gram weight, prefixes like deci, centi, and kilo to scale values up or down by powers of 10. It was simple, and that simplicity frightened people. Crossed resistance by the market stall. Change, even boring change, is rarely welcomed. Merchants were the first to protest. Bakers had used their own standard-sized loaves for years. Now, they were told to sell by grams. Tailors had to convert inches to centimeters. Landowners worried their holdings would be re-evaluated, possibly taxed differently. Some simply ignored the new units. Others faked compliance, carving false metric measurements into old wooden yardsticks. Still, the system spread, not with violence but with quiet persistence. The metric system did not conquer with cannon. It crept in with ledgers. Package, a silent revolution. By 1801, France mandated use of the metric system for all official trade. And while much of the countryside still clung to old units, the bureaucrats had numbers now, predictable ones. Tax collectors could tally grain with certainty. Soldiers could be issued uniforms that fit. Roads could be built using a common unit of length. No one cheered, but no one had to. It worked. It didn't change hearts. It changed habits. Candle, a measurement that measured time itself. The metric system even tried briefly to change time. In 1793, the French Republican calendar was introduced. 10 hours in a day, 100 minutes per hour, 100 seconds per minute, 10 days in a week, 3 weeks in a month. It was confusing and deeply unpopular. Farmers couldn't track the moon. Workers resented longer weeks. Clergy were outraged by the dechristianized month names. It was quietly abandoned in 1806. But the meter, the kilogram, they remained. Not because people loved them, but because they were undeniably useful. And yet, as the guillotine's shadow faded and Napoleon's empire rose, one question lingered like a whisper in the quiet halls of the bureau. If we can measure the earth, what else can we measure? The platinum bar sat in a quiet cabinet, sealed behind glass and brass, guarded not by soldiers but by silence. It was the meter, the physical embodiment of 10 millionths of Earth's meridian. Next to it, a solid cylinder of platinum, the first kilogram. Cold, heavy, perfect. They were not relics. They were the reference. But unlike relics, they weren't meant to inspire awe. They were meant to be used. Luggage from Paris to the provinces. In 1799, as the chaos of the revolution gave way to Napoleon's rising star, the metric prototypes were sent out carefully replicated, one, by craftsmen trained in exactitude. These copies were distributed to administrative centers throughout France, where local officials were expected to implement the new system. It was a slow rollout, quiet, calculated. But something unusual began to happen. The metric system created for internal unity began to cross France's borders. Not through force, through utility. Globe showing Europe, Africa, Napoleon's reluctant standard. Napoleon Bonaparte, first as general and later as emperor, had little love for the metric system. He considered it too abstract, too scientific. Men will never care for measurements that cannot be touched, he is said to have grumbled. Yet his armies, marching across Europe, carried more than muskets. They carried ledgers, requisitions, supply lists, blueprints, all using metric units. As Napoleon conquered Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, parts of Germany, and beyond, his administrators brought with them metric order. Kilometers replaced miles. Kilograms replaced stones and pounds. Metrication followed the roads, not the flags. Hammer, the engineer's dream. Civil engineers embraced the metric system before almost anyone else. Why? Because when you're building bridges or draining swamps, ambiguity is your enemy. A Roman foot meant one thing in Lyon and another in Naples, but a meter, it was the same everywhere, uniform, consistent, calibrated. Metric units made math easier. Decimals slid across pages like quiet servants. Architects no longer had to convert inches into cubits or fathoms into feet. Measurements became something you could trust. And so, silently, without ceremony, the system rooted itself in infrastructure. And infrastructure, unlike empires, doesn't fall easily. Scroll the Treaty of the Meter. After Napoleon's defeat in 1815, the metric system could have vanished. But it didn't. Instead, it spread. Over the next decades, country after country began to adopt the system not out of ideological allegiance to France, but because it worked. In 1875, representatives from 17 nations met in Paris and signed the Convention of the Meter, forming the International Bureau of Weights and Measures, BIPM. It was one of the first truly international scientific agreements. No protests, no wars. Just a quiet handshake over decimals. The meter and the kilogram were no longer just French. They belonged to the world. Straight ruler, the standard kilogram, slow decay. But perfection is a tricky thing. The original kilogram, kept in a vault near Paris called the International Prototype Kilogram, IPK, was meant to be immutable, unchanging, eternal. But over time, scientists noticed something troubling. Its copies stored in other countries were gaining or losing tiny amounts of mass, not much, just micrograms, but enough to matter. Was the IPK losing weight? Or were the others gaining? No one could say for sure. And in a system built on absolute precision, even a grain of dust was too much. The kilogram had become a paradox, a fixed measure that was slowly changing. Test tube the quest to define mass without metal. The scientific community responded not with panic, but with patience. For decades, physicists searched for a way to define the kilogram not by a physical object, but by a constant of nature, something unchanging, like the speed of light or Planck's constant. The problem: it was immensely difficult. Entire careers were spent refining watt balances, measuring electromagnetic forces, and comparing atomic transitions, all in pursuit of a weight that never wavered. In 2019, 220 years after the first kilogram was cast, the mission was complete. The kilogram was redefined in terms of Planck's constant. The platinum cylinder was no longer the reference. A number was unseen, untouched, but universally true. Reflections on the invisible. And so, the world now uses measurements based on the invisible. We define length by the distance light travels in a fraction of a second, mass by the energy of photons, time by the vibrations of atoms. There are no longer any king's thumbs, or iron rods, or platinum cylinders. Only constants. The meter is now a whisper of light. The kilogram, a flicker of energy. Measurements that no longer rely on touch, but on trust. Globe with meridians, a world quietly unified. Today, nearly every country on Earth uses the metric system. There were no parades for its victory. It didn't conquer. It convinced. With decimals. With consistency. With time. It took over 2 centuries, but the metric system became the most widely adopted standard in human history. All without firing a shot. And yet one question lingers, posed by a farmer, long ago, in a rural French market. If we all measure the same, why do some still have more? The meter, the kilogram, the liter, these units were born from a desire for clarity, for fairness, for the idea that every citizen, whether baker or baron, would weigh, measure, and pour from the same set of truths. And yet, even the most perfect system cannot smooth out the imperfections of human society. In the century that followed its creation, the metric system spread quietly across Europe. It standardized trade, calmed border disputes, and brought common language to engineers, scientists, and merchants. But in the homes of peasants, in the fields where hands met earth, equality of measurement did not always translate into equality of life. Abacus decimal does not mean fair. In theory, the metric system was designed to be democratic. It replaced regional confusion with uniformity. It took power away from local lords who could manipulate obscure units to their advantage. But for those at the bottom, the changes sometimes felt external, imposed from above. Old habits were hard to unlearn. A grandmother who sold apples by the liver pound now had to learn what 500 grams looked like. A shepherd who traded in toises and arpents suddenly needed to convert to hectares and meters. Conversion meant confusion, and confusion breeds mistrust. Some refused, others faked it, still others simply gave up, selling less or buying poorly, suffering quietly under a system meant to liberate. Shopping cart, the village market dilemma. In rural France, local markets didn't change overnight. Even after the state mandated metrication, many stalls still measured grain by the handful, cheese by the slice, fabric by the arm's length of the seller. To these vendors, their bodies were more reliable than government-issued rods. Inspectors came with metal meter sticks and scales calibrated in kilograms. They fined stallkeepers for short measures or illegal units. But the stallkeepers pushed back, often in subtle ways. They display goods in metric weights, then eyeball in old units for customers who asked. And many did. A peasant didn't want to know if a sack weighed exactly 2.5 kg. She wanted to know if it would last the week. Would it bake 7 loaves? Could it feed 5 children? The metric system had numbers, but tradition had memory. Thread the invisible stitch between systems. Over time, a compromise emerged. People didn't stop using old units entirely. They simply translated them into metric ones mentally, conversationally, intuitively. One liver, about 500 grams. One toys, roughly 2 meters. One boisu of grain, somewhere near 12.5 liters. The real revolution wasn't in imposing new standards. It was in building quiet bridges between the old and new, one market stall, one handwritten label, one whispered explanation at a time. Balance when measurement became surveillance. There was a darker side, too. As the metric system became more entrenched in law and bureaucracy, it became a tool not only for fairness but for control. Napoleon's regime and those that followed used standardized measures to better tax citizens, regulate trade, and oversee industrial production. A landowner could no longer underreport the size of his fields. A merchant could no longer fudge the weights of his goods. But with transparency came visibility, and with visibility came government reach. The same system that gave peasants a common weight also gave tax collectors better data. Equality, it turned out, was measurable and traceable. Adult education as implementation. One of the quiet revolutions that ensured metrication's survival wasn't fought in courtrooms or markets. It happened in classrooms. Children learned the new units as part of civic education. Arithmetic problems now asked. If Jean walks 3 kilometers to school and returns, how many meters has he walked? Marie buys 2.5 liters of milk. If she drinks 500 milliliters a day, how many days will it last? The units became part of life not through law, but through repetition. A child who learned to measure in meters would grow up to measure fabric, fields, or freight the same way. The change took generations. But it stuck. Not because it was forced. Because it was taught. Microscope the science of simplicity. Beyond trade and law, the metric system flourished in science. Natural constants like the speed of light or gravitational acceleration worked more cleanly in meters per second, newtons, joules. International experiments, especially in astronomy and chemistry, finally shared a common language. A gram was a gram in Stockholm as in Sao Paulo. It was not exciting, but it was revolutionary. And in a field like science, boring precision was more valuable than dramatic uncertainty. Package metrication's modern messiness. Today, nearly every country on Earth officially uses the metric system. Except a few, like the United States, still cling semi-officially to old imperial measures: miles, pounds, gallons, feet. But even there, metric lurks beneath the surface. Science is metric. Medicine is metric. Most food labels include grams. Every international product design, metric. You may drive in miles and weigh yourself in pounds, but your car's tire pressure is in kilopascals. Your soda is in liters. Your passport is printed in millimeters. Even in resistance, the system seeps in. Mantelpiece, the final irony. The metric system was designed to remove arbitrary references. No more king's feet, no more barleycorns, no more body parts. Yet today, when we say meter, we refer not to Earth's meridian, but to a definition so abstract that only physicists truly grasp it. A meter is the length light travels in 1/299, 792, 458 of a second. Precise, perfect, and utterly intangible. In pursuit of universal truth, we've made our measurements more invisible than ever before. And still we measure. Because to measure is to understand, to compare, to communicate, to agree, even if we don't always agree on what that agreement means. And so, a revolution born of rulers and rice scales did not overthrow kings or raise cathedrals, but it reshaped how we measure everything. quietly, persistently, decimally, 1 meter at a time. Story 4. When the wind slept the Polynesian voyages between storms. The Pacific Ocean is not one sea. It is thousands. Each wave, each swell, each whisper of wind forms its own history. And long before compasses, steamships, or satellites, it was the Polynesians who charted it not in ink or steel, but in memory. They crossed it in waka, vaca, and wea long canoes with outriggers or twin hulls, lashed with coconut rope and sealed with tree sap. These were not small journeys. Some covered thousands of kilometers. And yet, as fearsome as storms could be, the real danger was not wind that howled. It was when the wind stopped. Dove the doldrums of the deep. To a modern sailor, the doldrums, the equatorial calm belts, are just an inconvenience. An engine can bridge the gap between gusts. A GPS can confirm that motion continues, even when sails flutter uselessly. But for Polynesian navigators, these windless zones were existential threats. A voyage could stall for days, even weeks. And unlike a storm, you couldn't survive a dead calm. You could only wait. Sailboat preparing for a voyage of patience. You might think a great journey began with the push of a canoe into the surf. It did not. It began with listening. The navigator, often called the taonga or wayfinder, would rise before dawn, long before anyone else. He would sit, sometimes on the same rock every morning, facing the sea, not watching the waves but listening to their rhythm. He'd watch the flight of birds, the shape of clouds, the way certain stars dipped toward the horizon. And if all signs were favorable, he'd say nothing. He would simply begin preparations. Silently, because announcing a voyage before the ocean was ready was like shouting into a temple. Basket rations for the windless days. Polynesian canoes carried more than voyagers. They carried time. Bundles of dried taro and fermented breadfruit, wrapped in tea leaves. Gourds of fresh water sealed with waxy pandanus fiber. Salted fish, dried coconut, and bundles of sugar cane to chew slowly. Shell tools for repair, woven rope for lashes, extra paddles for currents. Every item had to last longer than expected. Because no one left without the assumption, the wind may sleep. Some islands even had ceremonial windstones or chants whispered to invoke breeze. But the sea, indifferent and vast, answered only to itself. Milky Way navigating without movement. When the wind stopped, the navigator's task didn't end. It deepened. No progress, no matter. The stars still moved, the waves still carried their memory. Even without sails full of wind, the canoe floated atop wave-patterned, subtle, long swells that radiated from distant storms or reefs. A good navigator could feel these through the hull, lying flat on the deck, eyes closed, letting the motion guide his thoughts. A swell from the northeast, likely Tonga. A countercurrent beneath, perhaps the canoe had drifted near a seamount. A scent on the air, distant guano, fresh rain, a sign of birds and thus land. The canoe was not still. It simply moved quietly. Candle the crew's rituals of waiting. When the wind died, the crew had few choices. No paddling, there was little point when the ocean lay flat and infinite. Instead, they waited. Some repaired ropes, others sang. Singing wasn't just for comfort, it was navigation. Chants held maps, the name of stars, the order of islands, the story of a previous voyage that succeeded only after 11 days of stillness. Young crew were reminded, no wind does not mean no progress. Because progress was not always movement. Sometimes it was patience, endurance, knowing that the wind would return. Just not when you wanted it to. New moon, the moon, and the breath of the sea. Polynesian navigators often charted wind patterns according to the moon. Certain phases favored easterlies, others doldrums. A full moon could bring breezes that stirred the sea, a waning crescent, eerie calm. But it wasn't the light that mattered, it was the pull. The moon's invisible grip on the tides was mirrored in its influence on air currents, humidity, and the behavior of clouds. A skilled navigator could lie awake beneath a waxing moon and predict the wind's return not by feel, but by memory. Generations had passed down these patterns, not in books but in chance. Drifting into the unknown. Stillness did not mean safety. A windless canoe drifted with the current, sometimes toward land, sometimes away. There are stories always told softly, as warnings of crews who drifted for weeks. One story tells of a canoe from Tuvalu, caught in a calm so long that barnacles began to grow on its underside. They ate their last coconut, then their fish bait, then chewed the wood of their paddles until the current brought them to land. They survived not by force, but by not panicking. They had learned what every Pacific voyager knew. The ocean moves at its own speed. And sometimes, the greatest challenge is not surviving a storm, but surviving the waiting between them. The doldrums were not a blank chapter in the story of Polynesian migration. They were the still page on which the story was written. And yet the question lingers in the salt air, suspended like a sail waiting to fill. How do you decide to keep going when there is no sign of change? The canoe floated not north, not west, not toward any visible land or known reef, but somewhere. The water below was dark and flat, reflecting stars so perfectly that the sky and sea became indistinguishable. It was as if the canoe drifted not on water, but on space itself. This was not failure. This was the discipline of drifting, the second phase of any Polynesian voyage that encountered stillness. It tested the crew not with waves, but with invisibility. No landmarks, no movement, no sound but the creak of the hull and the whisper of a tired rope. In such conditions, boredom could become more dangerous than the sea. Dove what the captain doesn't say. In many cultures, captains motivate with words, rallies, commands, shouts into the wind. But on a still sea, the Tonga said very little. He stood each morning at the bow and looked not for change, but for constancy. He did not tell the crew they would make it. He did not pretend the wind was near. Instead, he listened to the silence. And the crew, watching him, understood this is part of the journey. Not a pause, not a failure, just a slower sentence in the story of crossing. Last quarter moon keeping time with no clock. With no stars visible by day and no wind to measure, how did the crew keep time? The answer was, they didn't, at least not in the way we understand time. Instead of minutes or hours, they marked time by tasks. Since the fish stopped biting, after the last cloud passed, since the fourth boiled taro was shared. Time in drifting was a social measurement, a communal rhythm. A chant might be repeated at regular intervals, a prayer whispered as the sun reached a particular height on the mast. Some crews carved tiny notches into the canoe with shark teeth, one for each meal, or each night without wind. These weren't records. They were reassurances. Tropical fish reading the unreadable. Even without movement, there was information. A skilled voyager knew how to read the sea, even when it barely stirred. Fish behavior. Flying fish stopped leaping when currents shifted. Jellyfish, a cluster of certain types, indicated drifting near warmer shallows. Water color. Slight shifts in blue, greenish, silvery, indigo suggested proximity to reefs or seamounts. These cues, while subtle, could hint at where the canoe was drifting. And since Polynesian navigation relied on memory as much as sight, even the smallest observation could confirm direction. Not progress but position. Canoe repairs, rituals, and routine. Idle time was not wasted. While adrift, crews repaired sails, retied lashings, re-oiled wood with shark liver, or polished their fishing hooks made from bone, pearl shell, or turtle shell. Even prayer was practiced with precision. Offerings to the sea spirits were made with the final crumbs of dried breadfruit or drops of coconut water poured into the ocean. Rituals gave the stillness structure. Each morning a small chant was offered. Iokamakani iala. O wind, arise. Said not with desperation, but with discipline. Like a door gently knocked on, again and again, not knowing when it will open but trusting that it eventually will. Fog, false wind. One of the dangers of long stillness was false wind, a moment when the sails stirred, the water rippled, and hope surged. But it was often just thermal currents, or the breeze stirred by passing birds. To act on such signs too quickly, raising full sails, adjusting the canoe's direction, could burn energy, morale, and time. So navigators waited for confirmation. A shift in 3 signs. The shape of low clouds. The change in swell direction. The smell of land on the air. Only then would they act. Drifting wasn't inactivity, it was observation without assumption. Crescent moon, a night of change. One night without warning the swell changed. No wind. Just a faint rhythm beneath the hull, slightly longer, slightly lower. The navigator woke without being called. He sat bare-chested under the stars and lay flat against the wood. His ear against the canoe, he listened. The swell had shifted. A current from the southeast, a known sign that the wind might follow. He said nothing, just nodded and returned to his mat. The crew slept. By dawn, clouds gathered at the horizon in thin lines, low and fast. And then, a ripple, a flutter of sail, a groan from the mast. The wind had returned. The crew rose not with shouts, but with a kind of reverent urgency. They did not cheer. They moved, each man to his task. The sail was raised, the rudder adjusted, and slowly, after days, perhaps weeks, the canoe began to move forward. Quietly, steadily, surely. But before they accelerated too much, the Taonga called for silence. He stood at the bow, eyes on the horizon, and offered a final chant for patience. Let us not forget the stillness, for it taught us how to move. And yet, even with wind in their sails, one thought lingered like the scent of rain on distant land. What happens when the wind returns too soon? The wind returned soft at first, brushing the sails like a question, then stronger, firm, a pulse across the sea. It had the scent of far-off land and the rhythm of remembered roots. The crew felt its presence not only in the canvas above, but in the bones of the canoe beneath their feet. They had waited well. They had not panicked. They had not rushed. And now the wind had come, but not in kindness. It came fast. Too fast. Water waved the thin line between movement and mayhem. For a Polynesian canoe, the wind was both a friend and a trial. Too little and you drifted. Too much and you risked destruction. The wind that had arrived was from the southeast, familiar, yes, but sharp, laden with moisture and heavy with pressure. The horizon clouded quickly, the line between sea and sky blurred by the heaving swell. To a novice sailor, this was simply weather. To the Taonga, it was something worse, disruption. Not a storm, a hurried sea. And hurried seas were dangerous not because they smashed wood, but because they scattered minds. Sailboat holding course in hurry. The crew moved efficiently. Sail shortened. Lashings checked. Water gourds stowed. Cooking stones packed tightly. There was no panic. These were men who had drifted without fear. A strong wind was just another test, but there was one problem. The stars were gone. Thick clouds blanketed the sky, stealing the celestial map that had guided them for generations. With no sun, no stars, and only shifting swell, The canoe became isolated adrift, now not in stillness, but in speed. Navigation became guesswork, then instinct, then faith. Cyclone when the wind disrespects the rhythm. In Polynesian cosmology, the wind is not just air, it is character. Each direction has a name, a mood, a history. Moni, a gentle sea breeze. Madu, the dry wind of the uplands. Tonga, powerful, cleansing, sometimes cruel. Ula, rare, hot, and unpredictable. This wind had no name, or rather it had too many. It shifted, it argued with itself, it changed direction midday, it tangled the swell and confused the birds. The Tonga stood silently at the center of the deck, his eyes narrowing. This was a wind without respect. The missing signals. In earlier days, the crew had relied on seabirds for guidance. Naughty terns returning to roost before nightfall, proof that land lay within 40 kilometers. Frigate birds soaring high, signal of open sea and good weather. Shearwaters skimming, the water directional beacons in bird form. But in this wind the birds vanished. Even the ocean creatures had retreated. No dolphins swam alongside the canoe. No flying fish disturbed the surface. The sea, once rich with information, had gone silent again, but this time with tension. This was not calm. It was concealment. Hammered decisions in the dark. The canoe shuddered as a sudden gust caught the sail. The mast groaned. A lesser vessel might have splintered, but this one had been built over months, lashed by hands that knew what the ocean could do. The Tonga called for a course change, not toward a known island, but away from the wind's eye. It was a gamble, but Polynesian navigators knew that in the face of confusion, you did not challenge nature head-on. You moved around it. So the canoe shifted slightly, catching the wind at an angle that reduced strain but allowed controlled drift. They moved sideways diagonally, like a reef fish avoiding a net. It wasn't efficient. It was wise. World landfall or not. After 3 days of veiled sky and rolling sea, the clouds lifted briefly. Just enough. The Tonga saw a familiar constellation on the horizon, T Punga, the Southern Cross. From its angle and the orientation of the swell beneath them, he knew they were near Madu Tapu, a low-lying island with few trees and many coral reefs. They adjusted course. But what they found was nothing. No land. No reef. Only open ocean, disturbed by wind but empty. Had the sea misled them? Had they read the waves wrong? Or worse, had the island moved? New moon when memory fails. In Polynesian tradition, stories are passed down not only to remember, but to maintain truth. But even truths passed long enough can bend. Maybe the island had sunk, slowly eroded by tides and storm. Maybe it never existed. Maybe, as one old chant warned, the sea swallows what is not spoken of often enough. Whatever the reason, the crew was now many days from their original path, guided by a wind too strong, toward a land that wasn't there. The Tonga called a halt. The sail was lowered. They would wait again. Not for calm this time, but for clarity. Sunrise over mountains when the wind apologized. On the 6th morning, the sea grew quiet. Not flat but ordered. Waves returned to pattern, a gentle push from the east. The birds reappeared, first one, then many, circling. The sky opened, just enough to reveal the eastern horizon. There, low and gray, sat an island, not Matu Tapu, but a real one, unnamed. A gift, or a forgiveness. The crew did not shout. They raised the sail, they moved. When they landed, they did not speak. They offered thanks first to the wind, then to the sea, then to the stillness that had taught them how to move, and the haste that had taught them when not to. Hibiscus the return. When the crew finally returned to their home island, many weeks later, they were welcomed with song. Not for their destination, but for their discipline. Because in Polynesia, a successful voyage was not measured only by landfall, but by the way it was navigated. With patience, with trust, with readiness to act and readiness to wait. And so ends the story of a voyage defined not by storm or triumph, but by the deep, often overlooked truth that sometimes the wind that tests us most is not the one that knocks us down, but the one that arrives before we're ready to follow it. Story 5. The papermakers of Samarkand, quiet hands that built an empire's mind. In the 8th century, Samarkand was a whisper in the desert, a city of domes and dust, minarets and murmurs, nestled between the sands of Central Asia and the snow-fed waters of the Zarafshan River. It was not the center of an empire. It was not a seat of kings. It was something quieter, something older. A crossroads, where merchants walked slowly under weighed-down camels, where rugs whispered history in every knot, and where, one day, paper arrived not as an invention but as a memory carried by prisoners. Not warriors, not scholars, but paper makers. Horse battle, defeat, and an unusual treasure. The story begins in 751 CE at the Battle of Talas, where Arab forces clashed with the Tang dynasty on the banks of a river in what is now Kyrgyzstan. The battle was swift, the consequences slow. Among the Chinese prisoners captured were not generals or engineers, but artisans, people who knew how to do something the Islamic world had never seen up close. Make paper. Not parchment scraped from sheep's skin, not papyrus rolled from reeds, but true paper woven from old rags, pounded fibers and water. The Arabs brought these captives east, eventually settling some in Samarkand. There, amid spice traders and astronomers, these quiet men began to build vats. They asked for water, for cloth, for space. They did not fight. They worked. The process that required silence. Papermaking in Samarkand was a slow art. First came the rags, discarded cotton and linen garments, collected from homes and markets. The best rags were worn thin, free of dyes or decoration. They were not burned, not thrown out, not recycled into new clothes. They were boiled. For hours, sometimes days. The fibers broke down into a soft pulp, a gray-white slurry, with the consistency of overcooked rice. This pulp was poured into wooden vats filled with water. Long, flat screens made of reed or horsehair were dipped into the vats, capturing just enough pulp to form a single thin sheet. The screen was lifted, dripped, tipped, pressed, then peeled. Each step done in silence, for timing mattered. A single hesitation, a single wrong texture, and the sheet would be ruined. Wind drying in the shade. Once formed, the sheets were laid to dry not in sun, which would warp them, but in shade, on wooden boards, under smooth stones, weighted gently. They dried slowly, quietly. And when dry, they were burnished with smooth stones or bone tools, rubbed until their surface shone, not with gloss but with readiness. This was not paper for wrapping. It was paper for ideas. Books from rags to records. The early sheets of Samarkand paper were thick, fibrous, slightly uneven, but they held ink, and they lasted. Soon, merchants began using them for ledgers. Poets used them for verses. Officials used them for letters sealed with wax, wrapped in silk, tied with twine. And scholars, seeing their potential, used them for books. Paper transformed the Islamic Golden Age not with a bang, but with a slow expansion of thought. It was cheaper than parchment, easier to carry than clay tablets, more durable than papyrus. In Baghdad, in Cairo, in Bukhara, books multiplied. Libraries grew. And the knowledge once confined to palaces began to drip into the world. One rag at a time. Muted speaker, the anonymous makers. And yet no names remain. The papermakers of Samarkand were not credited in the books they enabled. They left no signatures, no marks, only texture, thickness, and the occasional strand of rag thread visible in the light. They were workers, not authors. But without their quiet hands, the astronomers of Meregha, the philosophers of Baghdad, the mathematicians of Damascus, may have written little at all. Because knowledge needs a medium. And that medium was shaped in wet rooms, by men who listened to the pulp. Basket the rag trade. As demand for paper grew, so too did demand for rags. Whole side economies formed rag collectors, washers, sorters. Rag merchants traveled as far as Constantinople and Kashmir, seeking discarded cotton and linen. In some towns, rags were taxed, in others hoarded. Wars were not fought over them, but debates were held how best to use them, who deserved access to the finest pulp. All for paper, paper which carried words, and words which carried power. Candle when the light was in the pulp. There's a tradition in Samarkand recorded much later, in the 12th century, of holding a fresh sheet of paper to the flame of a lantern to test its quality. If it glowed evenly, with no dark splotches or warping, it was said to be clear in mind. This wasn't just metaphor. Good paper meant good thought. And so the papermakers labored for decades, refining the pulp, smoothing the surfaces, adjusting the drying times, also that what was written would last. They never read the books. They made them possible. And yet one question remained on every faded rag passed to the vat. Who had worn it? What story did the cloth carry before it became silence beneath words? The books began to multiply. Not quickly, not loudly, but steadily, like snow collecting on the ledges of a silent city. Scrolls became codices. Codices became libraries. Ideas once kept in the minds of scholars were now laid flat across pages that bore the faint scent of old cotton and boiled river water. In Samarkand, the papermakers continued their work. Few of them could read the Arabic, Persian, or Turkic scripts that flowed across their creations. They did not need to. They knew the weight of a good sheet. They knew the breath it took to lift one from the vat. They knew when a stack of drying paper was too warm, too damp, too light. They worked not for recognition. They worked because paper had become the city's quiet heart. Fountain the ink masters. Paper alone does not carry knowledge. Ink must be invited in. Enter the Muharraran scribes, copyists, and calligraphers, who turned empty sheets into vessels of thought. They worked with reed pens, sharpened daily, and ink made from soot, water, and gum Arabic. Each batch stirred by hand, each pigment tested on scrap. Ink was judged by how long it took to dry fast enough to write a page, slow enough to allow correction. These scribes worked in dim rooms, hunched over low desks, copying by eye and memory. The best could reproduce entire pages of Quran or Avicenna's canon of medicine, without smearing a line. But even they, with their elegance and intellect, relied on paper. And that paper came from hands they never met. Magnifying glass tilted right hidden signatures. Occasionally, scholars found faint impressions at the corners of certain sheets, tiny depressions, shaped like flowers, birds, or knots. These were watermarks, likely accidental at first, formed by pressure or by reeds bent into shapes. Later they became intentional. Not signatures, not trademarks. Just quiet signals, this sheet was made well. Scribes came to recognize certain watermarks. They asked for them, preferred them. It was the only time the papermaker's work was noticed. Without a name, without a voice. Just a feeling in the fingertips. Books the house of wisdom, built on rags. In Baghdad, nearly 2,000 kilometers to the west, the Beit al-Hikmah, the house of wisdom, rose in the early 9th century. It was a center of translation, debate, and astronomy. But it would not have functioned without Samarkand paper. The translations of Aristotle, Galen, and Euclid arrived from Greece and Byzantium, transcribed first in Syriac, then Arabic. Every page required paper. As ideas moved, so did the demand for the material that held them. And so more vats were built, more rags collected. In Samarkand, the papermakers never saw the stars charted in their books, never heard the debates their sheets recorded, never met the students who would one day study under lamplight and become viziers, judges, and healers. But still they worked. Because in papermaking, the act of creation is not about understanding. It is about serving. To hump camel paper on the Silk Road. As caravans moved east to Chang'an and west to Damascus, Samarkand paper went with them. Light to carry, easy to store, foldable, durable. Paper became currency not of coins, but of credibility. A merchant's promise written in ink. A marriage contract. A land deed. A physician's prescription. A court record. And behind each of these, the ghosts of cloth once worn by children, tailors, or dancers. Transformed by hand. Fixed by fiber. Carried across continents. Basket when paper became a target. In times of siege or conquest, it was not gold that first burned. It was paper. Libraries were easy fuel. Scrolls fed fire faster than dry wood. But the papermakers had seen it before. So they adapted. Some sheets were coated with starch, resisting flames just long enough. Some batches were buried in sealed clay jars. Others, when word of war came, were hidden in bread ovens left to dry with real loaves. Paper could not fight, but it could hide. And from those hidden sheets, books were rebuilt. Samarkand rose again and again, not from stone but from rags. Cloud the season of slow work. During certain months, the river ran too high or too cold for proper pulp to settle. The papermakers did not force the process. They waited. And during those months they mended screens, rewove mats, sharpened knives, recited verses they did not read. One phrase passed from master to apprentice. Do not rush the vat. The vat does not rush the tree. The tree does not rush the cloth. All things arrive soaked in time. And yet one question fluttered like a dry sheet in the wind. When the world no longer remembers who made the paper, does it still remember how to read? The hands that stirred pulp in Samarkand rarely held power. They did not sign treaties or sit in courtrooms. They did not lead caravans or teach in madrasas. They did not write the stories, they built the surface upon which stories were told. And yet, centuries later, it is not the names of rulers that remain visible in corners of dusty manuscripts. It is the paper, still intact, still legible, still carrying thought across the ages, long after the voices that shaped it fell silent. In a world of conquerors, the fiber proved stronger than the sword. Classical, the quiet infrastructure of empires. Paper spread from Samarkand to every corner of the Islamic world. In Baghdad, it enabled translation. In Cairo, it organized taxation. In Timbuktu, it preserved poetry. In Andalusia, it introduced science to Europe. And in Delhi, it archived the orders of emperors. None of these changes shouted their origins. But at their heart was the slow, wet work of rag pounding and vat pulling. Paper did not just make books. It made systems. It allowed a civilization to remember to write treaties, record debts, tally births, pass down jurisprudence, and map the stars. Empires with stone roads, bronze coins, and iron blades were suddenly governed by sheets of pressed fiber. Reflections in the grain. Scholars today, examining manuscripts from the Abbasid and Timurid periods, can sometimes tell not just when, but where a piece of paper was made. Each city left a signature, subtle differences in grain, hue, and texture. Samarkand sheets, thick, slightly yellowed with visible cotton threads. Nishapur's paper, thinner, smoother, often whiter. Baghdad's reams, made for calligraphy, high polish, dense compression. And so, without knowing it, the paper makers left maps in their materials. Maps not of geography, but of practice. To read old paper is to feel the fingers that shaped it. Amphora, the vaults that time forgot. In 20th century excavations across Central Asia and the Middle East, archaeologists uncovered sealed jars in abandoned storehouses, some buried beneath collapsed mosques, others hidden in caves. Inside were stacks of paper. Some still bore ink, others were blank. But all had one thing in common: they were intact. Over 1,000 years had passed. The cities had fallen. The rulers had vanished. The languages had shifted. But the paper made by anonymous hands with boiled water and discarded rags remained. Waiting. Light bulbed the idea that could be carried. Why did paper matter? Because it allowed knowledge to be portable. Clay tablets cracked, stone was heavy, oral memory faltered. But a single sheet folded into 4, tucked into cloth, could cross deserts, could sail oceans, could survive generations. The Quran, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam, the legal treatises of Al-Sha Macron Fi letter 2 Bfi Macron, the diagrams of Ibn al-Haytham's optics all passed through time on the backs of Samarkand's labor. The paper makers had no need to know the contents. They only needed to believe that what they made would be used well. Repeat button the circle of rags. In time, papermaking moved west. Through Persia, through Mesopotamia, through Syria. To Egypt, then to Morocco, then across the Strait of Gibraltar. By the 12th century, European monks in Italy and Spain were making paper too, at first with Arab instructors, then on their own. But the techniques, the vats, the rag pulp, the drying frames, all carried forward from Samarkand. And so, the quietest workers of an eastern city, unnamed, unpaid, unnoticed, shaped the enlightenment that would emerge half a world away. A soft revolution of absorption and reflection. When paper outlasted power, the Mongols came in the 13th century. They burned cities. They shattered caliphates. Samarkand was sacked. Its libraries torched. But paper survived. Not in buildings, but in baskets, buried by hands that had done the same with bread. Some were hidden in shrines. Some in dried wells. Some in false floors. And years later, when peace returned, these hidden leaves were unrolled, smoothed, read, copied. The city remembered itself through its pages. The hands that had hidden them never returned. But their fibers held the truth. Candle final reflection, what we hold. Today, if you hold an ancient manuscript from the Islamic Golden Age, tilt it to the light. You may see threads, patches of discoloration, a faint watermark. You may run your fingers along the rough edge and wonder, who made this? Not the scribe, not the scholar, but someone hunched over a vat, someone who boiled a rag, someone who waited for the wind to dry a sheet in a shaded courtyard. You hold not just knowledge, you hold the memory of a process. Quiet, repetitive, anonymous, but without which history would have no page on which to unfold. Story 6. The slow bells of medieval monasteries, how time was measured in silence. Imagine a life where the day was not divided by your needs, your hunger, or your ambitions, but by bells. Soft, distant, unhurried, unquestioned. This was the rhythm of a medieval monastery. A rhythm set not by sunrises or rulers, but by prayer. Monastic life in Europe, particularly between the 9th and 13th centuries, was a framework of divine scheduling, a clock made of psalms and silence. Within its stone walls, time was not yours. It belonged to God. Bell, the bell that divided the day. The bell, in its simplicity, did what few rulers could. It organized people. But these were not alarm bells, not town criers or war signals. These were monastic bells. They rang not with urgency, but with certainty. They rang to say, "Now you wake. Now you pray. Now you work. Now you eat. Now you pray again." Bells rang for matins, in the deep hours before dawn. Then for lauds as the sun rose. And throughout the day, prime terce sex non vespers compline. 7 canonical hours. 7 moments to stop. 7 chances to remember that the day was not your own. Bricks, the architecture of time. Medieval monasteries were not just built for prayer, they were shaped by temporal design. Corridors angled to catch the morning light. Dormitories lined to ensure monks could rise easily when the matins bell rang, often around 2:30 a.m. Cloisters designed to funnel sound, so the softest bell could reach every cell. Even the placement of kitchens and scriptoria reflected time. The less time it took to walk there, the more time could be spent in contemplation. Every stone, every hall, every door placed with the intention of serving the schedule. The monastery did not revolve around human convenience. It revolved around divine order. Measuring time before clocks. Before mechanical clocks became common, how did monks know when to ring the bells? They used clepsydra's water clocks. They watched the shadows, sunlight crossing columns or striking lines drawn on cloister walls. They listened for birds, morning larks, and evening owls. They even used the length of psalms, knowing that a certain number of verses took a consistent time to recite. Over time, monastic timekeeping became more precise than civil time. Why? Because monks didn't chase time. They waited for it. And waiting makes you precise. Writing work within the hour. Monks worked, but their labor was always interrupted. Imagine copying a manuscript slowly, with a goose feather quill, only to stop mid-word when the sext bell rings. You set the pen down, you rise, you chant. Hours later you return. The ink has dried, the thought has cooled, you begin again. This was not inefficiency. It was a lesson in humility. The work was never more important than the worship. Even meals were timed not by hunger, but by bells. In winter, when daylight was scarce, dinner might be at midday. In summer, closer to evening. The bell adjusted with the sun. Shushing faced silence as a tool. In many orders, monks took vows of silence. Even outside of prayers, conversation was minimal. This wasn't just spiritual. It was practical. In silence, the bell's authority was total. When it rang, no one questioned it. No one discussed alternatives. No one negotiated 5 more minutes. They simply moved. It created a world where time flowed not as a race, but as a surrender. A day might pass without a single sentence spoken aloud, yet everything happened on time. Bread, the meal you didn't choose. Meals in the monastery were simple: bread, soup, vegetables, sometimes fish, rarely meat. You ate not when you were hungry, but when the bell permitted. And you ate in silence, listening instead to scripture being read aloud from a stone lectern. Time fed the body without conversation. Even digestion was contemplative. Bed, the sleep that was full. Monastic nights were short and fragmented. Matins came in the early dark, interrupting sleep deliberately. The point wasn't rest, it was discipline. Monks might sleep for 3-4 hours, rise for prayer, then sleep a little more before lauds. Their lives were not optimized for productivity. They were optimized for remembrance. And so, as the bell rang again, echoing across stone and shadow, a question hung in the air. What happens to time when it is no longer measured by desire, but by devotion? From the outside, a medieval monastery seemed timeless, its stone walls unchanging, its quiet life suspended in slow repetition. But from within, time flowed with remarkable precision. Not seconds, not minutes, but moments spaced by bells, prayers, candles, and the rhythm of the day. To live inside those walls was to experience time differently, not as something to be managed or spent, but as something bestowed. Not earned, not wasted, only received. Repeat button. The liturgy of the hours, a human clock. The divine office, also called the liturgy of the hours, was the heartbeat of monastic life. 7 times daily, and once in the middle of the night, monks stopped everything to pray. Each office had its hour and mood. Matins, night vigil, often at 2 or 3 a.m., long and solemn, filled with psalms and silence. Lauds, dawn, a praise-filled prayer as the first light touched the horizon. Prime, first hour, around 6 a.m., marking the beginning of labor. Terce, sext, none, short prayers at mid-morning, noon, and mid-afternoon, dividing the working day. Vespers, evening, a contemplative prayer as the sun set. Compline, night, a quiet end, often chanted by candlelight before sleep. Every monk's life was bracketed by this cycle. Every day was both repetition and renewal. Open book time in the manuscript margins. As monks copied sacred texts, they sometimes scribbled little notes in the margins. The snow is heavy today. The bell interrupted this line. Brother Thomas fell asleep during lauds. Such notes show the interplay between the sacred and the mundane. The margins were the only space where real time felt time entered the page. A line of psalms might take an hour. A complex illuminated letter might take 3. But no matter the task, when the bell rang, the pen was put down. Even the gospel paused for the office. Hammer labor divided by devotion. Daily work tending gardens, brewing ale, binding books was structured between prayer times. Labor became temporal punctuation. And because monks often worked alone or in silence, the bells functioned as communal reorientation, a reminder not just of God, but of each other. Even those deep in the fields or buried in the scriptorium could hear the chime. It was a call, but also a gift, to stop, to breathe, to return. Candle, candle clocks and shadow dials. In the darker seasons, monastic communities relied on candle clocks, candles marked with hour lines, which burned at a known pace. Each line represented an interval. When a mark melted, it was time. This was less about accuracy and more about trust in the wax, in the wind, in the quiet unfolding of divine schedule. Some monks even used incense clocks, where the sense progression through chambers marked time. These were clocks of sensation, not sound. They demanded not attention, but attunement. Musical note chanting time. Monks didn't just pray the hours, they chanted them. Gregorian chant was both prayer and timekeeper, each note a measure, each psalm a duration. Because these chants were memorized and repetitive, monks instinctively knew how long each office would last. Matins, long and slow. Sext, short and brisk. Vespers, solemn and glowing. The chant shaped time into something felt, not just heard. In this way, monks became walking metronomes of faith. Time carved in stone. Look at the architecture of an abbey like Cluny, Monte Cassino, or Lindisfarne, and you'll see more than bricks. You'll see temporal logic. The refectory close to the dormitory for ease after Compline. The chapel oriented east to catch the dawn for lauds. The cloister centered both spiritually and logistically as the axis of movement between prayer and labor. The layout itself became a physical clock. To walk the halls was to pass through time made tangible. Age measured in offices. In monasteries, Monks didn't count their years in birthdays or seasons. They measured their lives in offices kept. A young novice might count how many matins they endured in winter darkness. An old prior might recall the years he led vespers by how many candles he burned through. Even illness and death were timed. A dying monk might request Compline as his final prayer, letting go as the bell rang one last time. In a world without personal schedules, death itself was scheduled. But as the bells rang again and again, shaping silence into sound, a thought lingered. Could a life of complete stillness in time create a person more attuned to eternity? By the 13th century, something curious began to happen outside monastery walls. Merchants in cities like Ghent, Florence, and Lubeck grew frustrated. Bells rang from churches, yes, but not predictably. Markets opened loosely. Couriers missed each other. Civil life pulsed with disorder. But there was one place where time was never late, where hours were spoken with certainty, where people did not count time by feeling, but by ritual. That place was the monastery. And so slowly, quietly, monks who had never sought to control the world began to shape it. Gear, the invention of the mechanical clock. The first mechanical clocks in Europe were not built for towns. They were built for monasteries. The earliest versions, simple geared mechanisms powered by falling weights, appeared in the late 13th century in places like the Benedictine Abbey of St. Albans and later in Salisbury. Why? Because monks needed to ring the divine office at the right time, even when the sun was hidden or the candles sputtered. The clock didn't exist to measure productivity. It existed to protect prayer. Ironically, a tool created to preserve spiritual rhythm would become the foundation of capitalism, industrialization, and bureaucracy. Mantelpiece, the bell as civic tool. Eventually, town councils adopted bells for secular use. To open markets, to enforce curfews, to begin work shifts, to mark time for legal hearings. But the structure, the segmentation of time into repeating, predictable intervals was born in monastic life. A monastery, which once stood outside of worldly concerns, had unintentionally become the model for managing urban life. What had once been prayer became punctuality. Scroll from hours of God to hours of man. As mechanical clocks spread, so did the idea of time as measurable, ownable. Merchants began dividing labor into hours worked. Ships departed on calculated tides. Scholars began writing timetables for lectures. Yet inside the cloister, the rhythm remained unchanged. The bell still called for terce. The monks still walked in silence. The day still opened with lauds and closed with compline. Time had moved forward outside, but within, it held its ancient shape. Candle, the clock that didn't rush. Even as clocks grew more elaborate, ticking away seconds, chiming quarter hours, monastic time resisted fragmentation. A monk didn't ask, "What time is it?" He asked, "Is it time for prayer?" Time was not a quantity to consume. It was a space to inhabit. Even when clocks were installed in abbeys, they were often muted or placed in towers heard but not seen. They were servants, not masters. The bell still ruled. The sound of belonging. Monastic bells did more than mark hours. They created a sense of belonging. When the matins bell rang in darkness, a monk knew he was not alone. Others rose too. Others knelt in the same silence. When the vespers bell rang, it reminded the tired gardener, the weary scribe, the aging abbot, "You are part of this." The bell did not demand urgency. It offered inclusion. Old monks, old time. Some monks lived 50, even 60 years within the same walls. For them, the bell was not just structure. It was memory. The tone of a particular chime might remind them of a long-dead prior. The echo in the cloister might conjure snow-heavy winters or fragrant spring mornings. They did not keep journals. They did not count years. They remembered time by sound. Globes showing Europe, Africa, the afterlife of bells. Even today, in European towns and villages, bells still ring the canonical hours. Most people no longer know why. But the sound remains a distant echo of a time when life moved not in haste, but in reverence. Monasteries no longer dominate landscapes, but their influence lingers in every meeting scheduled by the hour, shift that starts on time, alarm clock that nudges us awake, calendar divided into weeks. Time is no longer sacred, but its structure still is. Thought balloon final reflection, a different kind of time. Perhaps the deepest legacy of monastic bells is not in how they ordered days, but in how they slowed them. In a world obsessed with time saving, monks practiced time serving. In a world that fears lost minutes, monks embraced quiet hours. In a world that fragments focus, monks returned again and again to the same hour, the same chant, the same silence. And maybe the question isn't how we lost this way of living, but whether we still hear the bell faintly in the distance, calling not to hurry but to pause.